Hello there and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to this special coverage of Ukraine fire. The 10th of March, by the title of No Progress. Negotiations mediated by Ankara were the first high-level contact between the two sides, Ukraine and Russia, since Moscow's military operation has been launched over its ex-Soviet neighbor. Ukraine's Dmitry Kuleba said he secured no promises from Russia's Sergei Lavrov to halt firing. Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, said Russia wants to continue negotiations with Ukraine, and President Vladimir Putin would not refuse a meeting with his Ukrainian counterpart Vladimir Zelensky to discuss specific issues. To this end, now we are living the fifth round of talks, again in Turkey, by the invitation of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And to this point, multiple questions come to the scene. Will this military operation, the so-called war by others, stop with diplomacy? And why diplomacy failed before? And how the West and NATO countries will face the division of world powers, Russia and USA, the West and the East. Our panel of guests, represented by Mr. Maximilian Hels, a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institutes from London, Alexei Yakubin, a PhD in political science from Kiev, Hussein Askaray, Iraqi national who is a board member of the Belt and the Road Institute located in Stockholm, Sweden. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. The discussion begins right after this break. And now, before moving down in our discussion, latest updates of Russian military operation in Ukraine in its 34th day. Ukraine and Russian officials are holding face-to-face talks in Istanbul, Turkey. Kiev says its top priority from discussion is to secure an immediate ceasefire, but both sides have played down the prospect of any breakthrough. President Vladimir Zelensky says Ukrainian forces have retaken control of Irpin, a key town located near the capital Kiev. Ukraine says it will resume civilian evacuations via humanitarian corridors after a one-day pause over safety concerns. Ukrainian authorities in Mariupol estimated that almost 5,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed since February 24th, the start of the Russian military operation in Ukraine. Mariupol witnessed several battles between Russia and Ukrainian forces. Some 150,000 others have fled the city or were evacuated through humanitarian corridors. Mr. Alexei, since you are in Ukraine, I will be starting with you. How can you explain the situation in city Mariupol precisely? What is special about this city that Ukrainian soldiers couldn't let it go, despite the casualties occurring day and night over there?
Well, Mariupol, it's a very important city for the Donbas region, because it's a city located some very huge industrial complex for the steel and so on. And this city important as a port. It's a Ukrainian port on the Azov Sea. And it's very, very important for Ukraine as a military base. But now we see some blocked this city, and in my opinion, now Russian aims in the war invasion into Ukraine. Now it's about not maybe Kiev, but it's about the east of the part of Ukraine, and also all the territory in administrative borders of Donbas Oblast and Lugansk Oblast, and some very important Ukrainian seaports, and Mariupol on Azov, but also Kherson on the Black Sea, and maybe in future it's Odessa. That's why, in my opinion, now for the Russian, they failed some blitzkrieg into Kiev, because now we see some support from people to the Vladimir Zelensky, Ukrainian power, some people's fighting for the country. But now Russian modernization the aims, and these aims, in my opinion, it's some eastern and southern part of Ukraine.
Perfectly understood. Now, coming to the second point, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan arrived on stage to deliver a speech to the Russian and Ukrainian delegations before the start of the peace talks, which is held in Istanbul. The Turkish president told the Russian and Ukrainian delegations that they must resume the face-to-face discussions in which both sides have legitimate concerns and that it is possible to reach a solution.
Both parties have legitimate concerns, and it is possible to reach a solution that is accepted by the international community.
Mr. Maximilian, coming to you now. Why only Turkey in Europe so far that took the initiative to hold these diplomacy talks between Ukrainian and Russians? Why UK couldn't manage to play the same role?
I think that is because of how the Russian government sees the Turkish position and because of the reconciliation between Russia and Turkey that we've seen over the last 6 years. Turkey is, of course, a NATO member, but it is the only one with major defense ties, with Russia having purchased the S-400 and incurred some U.S. sanctions over it. It's also expanded its own gas trade with Russia, yet at the same time, it is the key supplier of the important Bayraktar drones that are Turkish engineered to the Ukrainian army as well. So Turkey essentially has a position that it can sit in between and be seen as a credible mediator between these two countries, whereas the UK does not.
Sorry to cut you to your thoughts, but on the contrary, in UK, they unleashed unprecedented sanctions over Russia and Russians, such as Roman Abramovich. Why doing so?
Could you just repeat the last bit? It broke up for a second. Why are they sanctioning them?
Yes, why they are putting hard sanctions over Russians? They don't have any idea about what is happening in the Russia government. Why they are putting sanctions on Roman Abramovich?
Sure. The attempts to do so are an attempt to really put political pressure on the Kremlin. That includes by going after oligarchs who, like Abramovich, have good connections with the Kremlin. But we've already seen a number of those sanctioned over the last 8 years who are even more dependent on Putin and his inner circle than, for example, Abramovich is. But I think it's essentially part of a strategy to make clear that business as usual with Russia is no longer possible under a president who, as Joe Biden said, has committed such egregious human rights violations that perhaps he shouldn't remain in power. And that is really the intent there, is to essentially, rather than take the fight to the Russians, which is impossible given the mutually assured destruction and the nuclear capabilities of both sides, but is essentially to wage economic war on Russia.
Quite understood. Mr. Hussein, I know you are an Iraqi national, but you are living now in Sweden, so you are aware of the situation over there. Last week, Russian statements was like follow. If Finland, Sweden join NATO, we will take retaliatory measures. What that's supposed to mean?
Well, I don't think that Sweden and Finland and all these countries are directly involved in this conflict, although they support the Ukrainian army with weapons, as do most EU countries. But there is so much talk about attacks and retaliations and so on and so forth. But I think this is not simply as you say, this is not simply a Ukraine-Russian conflict. This is a part of a global development which has been ongoing for many, many years. The Ukraine has become the unfortunate scene for this global conflict, whereby Russia is supposed to be weakened and defeated, and also the whole Eurasian development, like cooperation with China, cooperation between the Eurasian nations and Europe. That is the target of this conflict. So instead of Ukraine becoming a bridge between the East and West, it's now have become not only a wall, but it has also become a very dangerous place where a global conflict can start from. Sweden's position has been, traditionally is to be neutral, But under pressure now from the EU, from political parties inside Sweden, it's taking a different position. And I think the Russians are worried that Finland and Sweden, who are practically neighbors of Russia, could become another area from which provocations can be launched against Russia. But this is not something that anybody here in Sweden wishes to see.
Do you think that the joining of the Scandinavian countries to NATO will be really beneficial to NATO itself?
I don't think NATO itself is beneficial for the world today. It's not beneficial for anybody to be part of NATO. NATO has served its purpose, and since the fall of the Berlin Wall, it has become obsolete. It has no purpose to exist. What is necessary is to have cooperation among nations, based, mostly economic cooperation among nations, and respect for the sovereignty of every nation. For Sweden, I mean, it's very clear that Sweden and Finland, there is no intention to become part of NATO. There is also popular resistance to this idea, traditionally, but also still now, even with this horrible conflict going on very close to Sweden. The public opinion has not completely shifted, although there is more support for joining NATO, but the general public are not in favor of that. I mean, they are in favor of that this conflict ends as soon as possible in peaceful means, as your program started with, that we need to have a negotiated resolution to this conflict, based on guaranteeing every party's security concerns, including Russia's security concerns and Ukraine. Perfectly. But I think ultimately what is necessary is that we have to have a new global security and economic architecture, going back to the United Nations Charter, going back to the principles of peaceful coexistence among nations, but most importantly, as we in our institute advocate, is that we need to have economic cooperation between East and West based on the Belt and Road initiative, based on the idea of building the new Silk Road, where everybody can benefit in a win-win
business.
Yes.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Maximilian, don't you think that this is a really strong statement said by Mr. Hussein, that anyone joining NATO now is not really beneficial? How can you say about this?
I would strongly disagree. I do think that there's a strong argument that NATO is perhaps better reconstructed somewhat, or at least reconfigured. But it's quite clear that countries that don't have these kind of security guarantees, such as Ukraine, are at the mercy of unilateral aggression by countries that seek to change borders. This is something that applies not only in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, where countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Putin has given up his former irredentist claims against these, which have joined NATO, but also which we see in South Asia, for example, with China's attempts to redraw the borders with Taiwan, or even in North Africa with Morocco and the Western Sahara. I think it's quite clear that friends are able to give countries and territories security guarantees that decrease the risks of war. Yes, there is truth that NATO is a Cold War institution, and that often when these very large defensive pacts come about, such as we saw with NATO and the Warsaw Pact, rather than go to war against one another, they fight proxy conflicts, as again North Africa experienced a number of. But I think it's quite clear that yes, perhaps there's overdue for an updating of NATO, but it's very clear that mutual defense and communal defense is something that works, and that not only is useful in terms of responding to conflicts, as we saw, for example, after 9/11, the one time that Article 5 of NATO has been invoked, but also, more importantly, in deterring them. And so by having these kind of alliances, you make war less likely.
I beg your pardon, Mr. Maximilian, by saying that NATO, wherever they enter, they make the situation even worse. Now, it's been years and years of the Sahrawi situation, but yet there is no solution. So I believe that Mr. Hussein has a strong argument to say that no one is really beneficial from NATO. Mr. Oleksiy, do you agree or disagree with the situation right now?
If we are looking at the Ukrainian situation, NATO now, it's not a good way for the Ukraine, because now we see in situation that some Ukrainian problems, it's a problem because NATO not join Ukraine maybe in the past, and also NATO simulate maybe, in some positions that the way to open for Ukraine, some glass door for Ukraine, but without real join. And in Ukraine, it's some problem because now Russia to use this situation against Ukraine and this war Russia against Ukraine in some aspect it connects with the situation about the NATO, about the not join NATO for Ukraine maybe in 2008, because some position of the France, Angela Merkel, and Germany, against Ukrainian join to the NATO in the past, and this situation now for the Ukraine now it's a problem because in Ukrainian constitution, past president Petro Poroshenko to sign that Ukraine has some Euro-Atlantic aiming, and it's a problem because from the Russia in the negotiate now we hear about the natural status for Ukraine, not NATO, but NATO status. And the past power in Ukraine, past authority of the Ukrainian authority, Petro Poroshenko and his parties, they did not realize some referendum about the NATO because some opposition politics, for example, Yuri Boyko, they talking about the referendum, but in Ukrainian constitution, NATO adopt without a referendum, and now we have some problems with this because this Russian invasion one of the official positions.
Mr. Yakubin, I'm sorry to stop you. We'll come to this point. The head of the Russian diplomacy, Sergei Lavrov, announced that a decree is in preparation to limit access to the Russian territory to nationals of countries responsible for unfriendly acts in the midst of the wave of sanctions against Moscow. Let's hear it.
A presidential decree draft is in preparation to introduce retaliatory measures concerning visas in connection with unfriendly actions of several foreign governments. This draft provides for a whole series of restrictions to enter Russia.
I'm coming back to you, Mr. Olnaksy. As a Ukrainian, do you think that the sanctions imposed on Russia were enough so far to help Ukraine? Or it is like Ukraine allies have done nothing? How can you see the issue as a Ukrainian?
No, it's interesting situation because in Ukrainian position, sanction is important, and Vladimir Zelensky calling for the Western politician about the sanction, about the close the sky, and so on. But sanctions, it's about the not a short effect, it's about the some maybe middle or long outcomes on the Russia, but Ukraine need now some changes about and some changes in the Russian behavior. And maybe this sanction policy from the West against Russia, it look like that it's some Western, maybe American position for the limited Russia, and Ukraine now in this situation it's only some tools, maybe some cynic, but it's look like this situation. And for some Ukrainian people, this situation is not very good because Ukraine need help from the West.
Definitely.
Now, weapons, but West maybe seeing the situation that it's a long game.
Okay, okay.
But long game, but war on the territory of Ukraine and bombs explosion in the Ukrainian cities.
Saying it is a war game. I'm sorry to cut you to your thoughts.
1 minute.
Go
1
ahead.
minute. Maybe it's some long game. United States against China and some ties China with Russia, but. It's not helping Ukraine in this situation.
Perfectly
because
understand.
Ukraine,
Okay, it means that Ukraine has been sacrificed for. Mr. Hussein, this is a direct question to you as an Iraqi national. Why Iraq, when it was attacked by Americans, no one stand or even condemned U.S. actions that time? And now they are all against Russia because it's a European country that attacked another European country.
Yeah, well, we had after the fall of the Soviet Union, we had people who were advocating that now we have come to the end of history. We have one unipolar power in the world, which is the Anglo-American empire, where Britain is the brains and the United States is the muscles, and that they can do whatever they want. They set the rules. Later, it was called the rules-based order, which has no respect for international law. It has no respect for any norms. And that has become, that everybody accepted that. Now, since 1991 and also 2008, the world has changed dramatically, because while we have a decline in the West, in the United States, and in the EU specifically, economically, socially, culturally, the infrastructure, the healthcare, the education, we have had a fantastic rise in the same areas in China, now in India, in the neighbors of China and India, and even Russia managed to get out of the destructive economic policy of the 1990s imposed on Russia by the IMF and World Bank and the West. Mm-hmm. Now, that imbalance now has created a completely new situation. So the people who live in this new American century mentality have a very difficult time accepting the fact that China, Russia, India, other nations are rising economically and could rival the West in their both economic power and also their military power and scientific power. So people have to abandon that very strange ideology that the West, the United States and Britain and their followers in the EU don't set the rules for how the nations of the world will behave. We have to go back to the United Nations Charter, respect for nations, but we have to establish a new architecture where the West have to accept. Look at the sanctions policy, for example. It's hurting Europe. It's hurting Germany. The Germans might have blackouts soon. They will have to decide if they run the railways or they run industries, if they have power for hospitals or for schools, quite soon. And this is a result of many, many years of destructive economic policy, of deindustrialization in the West, while we have a massive industrialization process in the rest of the world. And this imbalanced situation is creating this kind of tension where the people who still have military intelligence and media power in the West, they don't want to abandon, their power position. But the reality is that their society, the people in the United States, the people in Britain and in Europe, the infrastructure, the healthcare systems. We saw what happened with the Corona pandemic, where everybody was paralyzed in the United States and in Europe. China came to help us here, even with medical assistance. I mean, most of the American medical materials, they come from China.
To this point,
Europe and the United States, they were completely caught, in the bed, as they say here in Sweden. They didn't know how to deal with this pandemic.
We'll be coming to this point.
That's a result of many, many years. The United States and Europe or the EU are not in a position to dictate anymore to the nations of the world how they should live, what rules they should follow, and so on. We need a completely new architecture.
Perfect. Mr. Maximilian, our guest of panel, Mr. Hussein, he's saying that US and the United Nations has now the right to dictate what the world should do, because no one has the right to dictate for them what they do. So, as a European, how can you describe the situation right now?
Sure. I'd like to respond to some of Mr. Askari's points, which are interestingly put, but not necessarily entirely accurate. The rules-based international order includes the United Nations, of which he speaks, of course. These were built up by the international community in response to World War II in an attempt to try to make sure that no such thing would ever happen again. The countries that put us at risk of such things happening again, Russia, as is quite clear, or China with its genocide of the Uyghurs, which sadly there hasn't been an international response to. These countries, abusing, jailing, torturing millions of Muslims, bombing, killing Ukrainians, Syrians, these fall outside the international order, and it is only right that they be sanctioned. He is certainly correct about the economic development of countries like China, but this is very importantly also based on this exact same rules-based, dollar-denominated international order. And you don't have to ask me, you just have to look at who is the largest holder of U.S. Treasury bonds, the key dollar instrument in the world, which is, of course, China. China has a lot to benefit from this system. This system is what has helped bring China out of its historic poverty and back into its position as a leading international country. There's a reason China still has a closed capital account and doesn't allow the free flow of movement in one way or another, because they're actually fairly happy with the dollar-based international order. The Russians, however, certainly are not. We've seen that by their response to sanctions, but that's impoverishing the Russian people as we speak. And these crippling sanctions are going to put Russians back into levels of poverty not seen since the 1990s. And just to finish off on that point, it was in 1998 when the IMF, World Bank, and the West helped Russia recover from its domestic financial collapse that put Russia on the basis for the growth that it is now, because it was such a good part of the international community and had very good relations and was able to work together with them. The Putin regime has no interest in doing any of that, and will be impoverishing the Russian people for decades.
Mr. Maximilian, beg your pardon, but the statement is well clear that why, when the attack happened on Syria, Libya, Iraq, no one condemned the actions. But now, when Russia is moving forward and economically, militarily, with its allies such as China and other countries in Eastern Europe, all the world is enraged and having a war drive against Russia. Why?
Look, many countries, including the United States, have made lots of foreign policy mistakes. I would certainly agree with that. Iraq was a war crime and a disaster, and something that I think the United States has not done enough to fix and apologize to put right. But the West has responded to some of those other disasters, which weren't so close to its doorstep. Of course, the United States did intervene in Syria, both against the horrors of the Islamic State, as well as against the brutality of the Assad regime. We can debate whether it went far enough, but further responses would certainly have risked a wider conflict in the Middle East. I think the ability to respond to the level that we've seen over the Ukraine crisis is not only because, one, it's at Europe's borders, so Europe feels more of an immediate security threat, but two, is precisely because of those defensive alliances that we spoke about that don't exist in the Middle East. And because of that, Europe and the United States can stand and speak with one voice through NATO and make clear that an attack on any one is an attack on any other. There is no kind of security infrastructure like that in the Middle East, depending on where one's position is, to dissuade against an Iranian attack or a Saudi attack. And of course, finally, my final point is, amid all of this, China has been genociding Muslims, right? Committing a genocide against the Uyghur people of East Turkestan. So I think one can debate the lack of response from the West, but certainly that the lack of response doesn't equate to the dramatic crimes against humanity that we've seen carried out in Kashgar.
Mr. Hussein, he's saying that everyone is putting some pressure and everyone is committing crimes, but the justification is based on the situation happening. Now is saying that China is committing crimes, but also no one condemns, such as US has done. So what are you saying about that?
Well, there's as much evidence that China is committing, genocide against the Uyghurs and Muslims in China as there was evidence that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. This was an invention of Tony Blair and British intelligence, and they sold it to the Americans, who swallowed it. The whole world knows that. Now, some people, when crimes against humanity are committed against the Iraqi people, where you have 1 million people killed, that's called a mistake. So that's a bit. With that logic, the British-American intervention in Syria and Libya, and which wreaked havoc in all those countries and all of Africa, actually unleashed terrorist groups all over Africa. That was the work of the United States and Britain. Now, that is not a beneficial intervention. It's not a humanitarian, and it has nothing to do with the United Nations. Tony Blair invented the responsibility to protect, to abolish the most important aspect of the United Nations Charter, which is that nations are sovereign and independent, and there should be no intervention in their internal affairs. Now, the fact is that there are all these lies about genocide in China, which are concocted by the same people who invented the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, the same intelligence circles and media circles who invented those lies. In China, this is the only place in the world, in the history of mankind, where the genocide leads that the population, which is subject, the victims, increase in numbers and their living standards become better. This is a very strange kind of genocide. So all these things are not really beneficial for the discussion we have today. I think what should be put in place is that we get rid of these rules-based, these inventions which have led to the suffering and killing of masses of people in Iraq and Syria and Libya and Africa and Afghanistan now, where the United States and Europe, they are stealing the money of the Afghan people so they cannot buy food and medicine.
Perfectly
and they,
understood.
So this is criminal activity. This is not a mistake. And
we will come to this one. Mr. Oleksiy, do you think that Ukraine has been sacrificed for an already agenda has been made? Because now there is a war happening in the battlefield of Ukraine. Do you think that Ukraine is paying the price of the war between the West and the East?
It's something look like. Because in my opinion, some reaction from the West, maybe it's some signal, not only Russia, but to the China about the Taiwan situation. Because maybe some strong or some sanction reaction according to the Russia, it's some signal to the China that if China will take some actions against Taiwan, the West solidarizate some sanction or some another actions against China. Yes, seriously, it's look like. But also, in my opinion, the main important role in this situation is some maybe culturalistic factors, because Ukraine, it's a European country, it's a country that has close ties with some Eastern European countries. That's why for the West, it's not some situation in Africa or some far from Asia. It's a situation in Europe, and maybe some reaction from the West that Ukraine is a European country, But in my opinion, one of the most problems for Ukraine now is that maybe some Western leaders looking to the Ukrainian situation is some big game, in geopolitical sense against China. And for Ukraine, it's not important. Because Ukraine now needs some ceasefire, some peace treaties, but maybe for some Western leaders, it's not their aim. Because in my opinion, from the West, it's not enough some efforts for the peace treaty between Ukraine and Russia. It's not enough some weapons for Ukraine, because Vladimir Zelensky calling about the closer sky, much more weapons, but that's not good in this position for Ukraine. Maybe they're thinking about that some slow war is good. But for Ukraine, it's not good,
Sorry to interrupt your flow of ideas. Mr. Maximilian, now, the lack of time, we will come to an end for our TV show. So, In 2 words, what can you say about the negotiation happening right now in Turkey? Do you think that we will have a solution?
Sadly, I'm very pessimistic about the negotiations that are ongoing. The Russians haven't sent a particularly high-level delegation, and in the past, we've seen Russia engage in a large number of negotiations that it genuinely doesn't intend to follow through on or uphold. We saw that with the Minsk agreements in 2014. Russia never withdrew its own forces or its support as it was supposed to in that agreement around the Ukraine conflict. We saw that in a whole host of negotiations around Syria and Libya as well, where the Russians would use negotiating tactics to buy time. Or, for example, at one point they agreed to take away the chemical weapons from the Assad regime, and they never did that, of course. And the chlorine weapons, which technically aren't chemical weapons, but are just as brutal. So, sadly, I'm very pessimistic, and I don't see a likely outcome right now. Just while we are speaking, we've seen the Russians' Ministry of Defense announce that they're pulling back in Chernihiv and Kiev. Again, it's too early to actually believe that this is true. But if that is true, that's a sign of a real loss on the ground. And I do think they'll instead switch to, as Alexei was saying earlier, a strategy of attacking in the east and trying to really make sure that they can take all of the Donbass and eastern Ukraine. But sadly, I think Putin's unwarranted, illegal war of aggression on Ukraine is going to continue, at least for the next days and probably weeks.
Sorry to interrupt your flow of idea. Thank you so much for your idea. Mr. Hussein, do you think that the Russia's sanctions that has been already imposed on the economy of Russia will give an idea to the allies to stop Russian invasion or the so-called military operation?
No, I don't think these sanctions will have an effect. I mean, on the military operations themselves. The sanctions, of course, they have affected the economy of Russia, but not to that degree that the Russians are crippled or unable to do anything. And this is the wrong policy. On the other side, Russia has already, I said the world has changed. Now, many nations in Asia, in Eurasia, want to work with Russia, want to have trade with Russia. And China, which is the world's largest industrial economy, not the largest economy, but it's a huge industrial powerhouse, still committed to working with Russia. And therefore, this is not, but I think this situation is so dangerous is that we will not have time to see the effects of these sanctions planning out. What we need now is that to support these negotiations, that Ukraine should be also allowed to decide for itself. We should not be cheerleading for Ukraine to continue the provocations against Russia. Russia should be told that they can have their security guarantees if they stop this operation. And therefore, what we need is that the world, we need some, calm heads to intervene instead of cheerleading for war. We need to have a massive mobilization for peace in the world, including from the United States, from Europe, and other nations, to have a new international, as the Schiller Institute is calling for, to convene an international peace conference where all the nations are involved. Thank you, Mr. Hussein.
To this point, Mr. Alexei, Mr. Hussein is saying that Ukraine has the solution in its hands, that they stop provoking Russia and give solutions by a peace of talks or talks of peace. What are you saying about this? The Ukraine can bring the solution by itself?
No, in my opinion, for the Vladimir Zelensky, it's important, but maybe some international powers from the West, maybe it's not for these powers. Maybe it's not important because maybe in their interest to continue, seriously, this situation with the wars. But for the Ukraine, it's not important, because they say that this war relies on the Ukrainian territory.
Thank you, Mr. Yakubin. Thank you. I have been called to come and end to this show. Mr. Maximilian, Mr. Hussein, Mr. Yakubin, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. I really appreciate your presence. Thank you so much. To this end, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special coverage will be held tomorrow, inshallah. Bye-bye for now.